Hello, and thank you for connecting with us today. This is the Bologna Peacebuilding Forum 2021. My name is Bernardo Monzani, and I'm the president of the Agency for Peacebuilding. I'm also the facilitator for today's first session. Before we get to that, however, I have a short introductory note, and I'll go right through it. I will assume that this is a way also to allow more people perhaps to connect, as there's always a few latecomers. Let me start by saying that the idea, the forum, is an idea turned reality of the Agency for Peacebuilding, the organization that I represent here today. Our mission is to promote the conditions to resolve conflict and create sustainable peace in Europe, in its neighborhood, and the world. And with the forum, we want to facilitate a dialogue among practitioners, academics, and administrators coming from agencies all over the world on how best we can do this. This is the third edition of the forum. Unfortunately, the pandemic has forced us to have the event online again, but on the plus side, we are able to accommodate more participants than ever before. In fact, more than 350 people have registered so far, which is great. This is likely due, of course, and we realize that, to the chosen topic for this year, which is peace building and climate change. It is a topic that indeed garners more and more attention as the impacts and consequences of climate change become more and more clear. If you would like to learn more about the Agency for Peacebuilding, please feel free to visit our website. And should you be so inclined, you can always register for our newsletter as well. Now, before I pass on to the first session, which is the reason why most people, like all of you, are connected today, I do want to take the opportunity to thank our partners and supporters, starting from the Rotary Club Bologna Ovest, the NewMed Research Network, the University of Bologna, the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies, the Italian Agency for Development Cooperation, the municipality of Bologna, and the Emilia-Romagna region. So this could not have been possible without their kind support and patronage. And so we thank you very much. And of course, we thank all of you for choosing to be here with us today. And with this, let me start with the proceedings and kick off our first session. The title of which is Climate, Conflict, and Peace Building. And what we wanted to explore through this session is the question of how does climate change affect both the causes and the evolution of violent and armed conflicts? And what are the implications for peace building? What does it mean for people who actually work towards peace, like us and many of you connected online right now? Before I switch to the speakers, and we have three excellent speakers lined up for today, which I'm really excited to hear and introduce. Before I do that, however, just a quick note on format. Each expert will have the chance to give a 10-minute presentation in this first part, and I will introduce them, and then I will give the floor to them. At the end of the presentations, we will have the opportunity to have a bit of a question and answer. However, I will be collecting and facilitating the Q&A. And I'll be collecting questions only through the chat function, just because there's so many of us connected today that is the simpler thing. So if you have a question to ask, feel free to put it on the chat and I'll monitor and I'll note it down, and then I'll use it once we get to that moment. And with this, let me turn to the first speaker for today, which is Dr. Farah Hegazi. Farah is a researcher in the Climate Change and Risk Program of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Her research focuses on identifying and understanding climate-related security risks and how interventions to address the effects of climate change can be used to build peace. Before joining SIPRI, Farah worked on environmental security and peace building at the Environmental Law Institute and the Center on International Cooperation. Farah, the microphone is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernardo. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for coming, first of all, and thank you to the Agency for Peacebuilding for inviting me. I will have to say there's some construction going on in the background, so if you hear drilling, there's not much I can do about it, but if you can't hear me, please let me know. I am here today, I'm going to talk to you about SIPRI's approach to the relationship between climate change and conflict. The effects of climate change on security are highly contextual, and they depend on the broader social, political, and economic context. Now, these can be factors like the presence and strength of social institutions, a population's vulnerability and resilience, the temporal and spatial extent of a climatic event, and even social attitudes towards displaced populations. So at SIPRI, we take a pathways approach to the relationship between climate change and conflict. Now, this means that we look at that relationship as being process-oriented. So it's about how climate change affects human security and what are the conditions under which we see impacts on conflict and security more broadly. And then, so within that framework, we've identified 4 pathways. The first is worsening livelihood conditions. The second is migration and mobility. The third is the tactics of armed groups. And the fourth is elite exploitation of local grievances. These pathways, of course, analytically we think of them separately, but they're, of course, they all interact with each other. And I hope you see that through the examples that I'll bring up soon. In the interest of time, I'll focus on 2 of the pathways, one of which affects the causes of conflict, and the second affects the evolution of conflict. Now, on the causes of conflict, I'll focus on worsening livelihood conditions. So the detrimental effects of climate change on livelihoods can increase the risk of conflict. And these worsening livelihood conditions can marginalize the groups that are affected by this and contribute to escalating grievances. And in the absence of any sort of alternative income sources, there is a greater risk that people use violence to either protect or access the dwindling resources. So worsening livelihood conditions and the absence of alternatives can also increase the risk that people are pushed to join armed groups to mitigate their losses. So essentially, if you're in a setting where you have no alternative to what you're used to engage, to the livelihood that you're used to engage in, and your only option is to join an armed group, then that becomes one way for you to generate income. So in addition to that, the diminished capacity to manage local resource tensions or to find viable alternative livelihood sources are also important factors in the pathways from connecting climate change to livelihood insecurity and then finally to violence. Now, one example of this is from our recent research on climate security in Mali. What we've found is that more erratic rainfall and changes in the start of the rainy season have affected both the availability of water and the availability of pasture. Now, this means that pastoralists are migrating earlier in the season, and they're changing their migration routes to go to new areas. And so in turn, they come into contact with farming communities with which they don't have previous land use arrangements. And that increases the risk of conflict between farmers and herders. The second aspect of this is that conflict between herders and farmers in Mali has existed for a very long time. This is nothing new. The difference today, though, is that local mechanisms to manage conflict around natural resources have changed, which means that when pastoralists migrate earlier in the season, the probability of conflict, as I said earlier, increases. And what I mean by this is that there has been a shift in who enforces social norms and natural resource management arrangements. So it used to be in the past that it was local non-religious leaders who managed the resources and who managed the conflict, but their authority is now in question by young people who are armed and who are empowered through their involvement with armed non-state groups. So all of this is essentially to say that the combination of rainfall variability and a change in local power structures has really undermined the ability of traditional conflict resolution mechanisms to address conflict between herders and farmers. So that was on the causes of conflict. Now on the evolution of conflict, I'll focus on the tactics of armed groups. And I'll preface this by saying that recruitment dynamics are incredibly complex, and there are lots and lots of reasons why people join armed groups. So climate-related loss of livelihoods is one of those reasons because it increases the recruitment pool for armed groups. And again, I'll use an example from our recent research on Mali. So what we found is that there are three factors that contribute to natural resource scarcity in Mali. One is climate change, the second is conflict, and the third is population growth. And combined, it's these three factors that reduce people's livelihood options, especially for herders and farmers, and that creates recruitment opportunities for both criminal groups and armed non-state actors because they offer these economic incentives for people to join. In Gao and Mopti, for example, so Gao is a region in northern Mali and Mopti is a region in central Mali. Both of those regions are highly susceptible to droughts and floods. So between the 1970s and 2000, there was, for example, only enough rain to produce millet, which is a staple crop in Mali, in 1 out of every 3 years. Whereas if you compare with the climate between the 40s and 70s, you had enough rainfall to produce millet in 2 out of every 3 years. And it's patterns like this that have a negative impact on households' ability to generate income for themselves. So that's on the how climate change has affected conflict. Now the second, how climate change has affected livelihoods. The second aspect of this is that conflict also affects the natural resources that Malians rely on for their livelihoods. In Mopti and Ségou, which are both in central Mali, there was this recent survey that indicated that about 60% of respondents said that insecurity had negative effects on both agriculture and livestock. The third factor is, as I mentioned earlier, population growth, which in Mali is growing at about 3% per year. And that places increasing pressure on the country's natural resources and has been associated with unsustainable agriculture, soil degradation, and has in some cases increased competition for land. So it's the effects of these triple pressures on livelihoods that increases people's vulnerability to recruitment and exploitation by armed non-state actors. And again, in the absence of alternative livelihood options, people's survival could depend on joining some of these groups. One example that was noted to us when we were doing our research is that there seemed to be a relationship between child recruitment and scarce rainfall in central Mali, because families that depend on agriculture for their livelihood send children to armed groups as a means of generating income when rainfall is scarce. And during a normal rainy season, however, there is noticeably less recruitment and involvement of children in armed groups. Another example that came up while we were doing our research was that groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb have provided employment opportunities for youth. So I'd like now just to shift to say something a little bit about the implications for peace building. And I'm not a practitioner, so I'm very happy to hear from anyone in the audience who is. But broadly, the interventions that we implement have to address the factors that show up in the pathways that we analyze. Now, you'll notice that these pathways are very complex. But the good thing is that they are complex because they offer multiple entry points for proposing solutions. Yeah, I'm almost done, Bernardo. Thank you. Yes, so they're complex, but they offer multiple entry points. Essentially what we have to do is break the chain that connects A to B to C. And the good news is that there is research demonstrating that interventions to manage natural resources can have a positive effect on peace building because they break that chain. What we have to ensure, though, is to implement programming that's appropriate for the context that we work in, because, for example, what works in Sudan may not necessarily work in Mali. And with that, I'd like to say thank you, and I really do look forward to the discussion.